Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Easton, president of the Claire Booth Luce Policy Institute, and I want to welcome you all to the November Conservative Women's Network Luncheon. Special thanks to Becky Norton Dunlop here, our co-partner in this for many, many years. We've had some good monthly events, haven't we, over the years?
Absolutely.
Thanks to you. Now today I'm pleased to introduce Karlyn Bowman, who's a senior fellow and research coordinator at the American Enterprise Institute. Karlyn uses polling data to compile and analyze American public opinion on a variety of subjects, including everything from the economy and taxes, the environment, marriage, and national security issues. Karlyn also studies and speaks about the evolution of American politics due to key demographic and geographic changes. Today, she's going to share some of her insight and analysis of this month's midterm election results. As you all know, it was a good day for conservatives, including many conservative women leaders. And she's also going to talk about where public opinion in America stands today. Karlyn frequently lectures on the role of think tanks in the United States. She writes a weekly column for Forbes.com and is a contributor to The American. Previously, she was a fellow at the Institute of Politics at Harvard University's JFK School of Government, and she earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin. Please join me in welcoming Karlyn Bowman.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's also wonderful to see Becky, who's a longtime friend and colleague in many of the areas that we've worked in over time. I was in this auditorium just a few years ago. I haven't been in the auditorium in a while, and it's a good place actually to start my talk today because I came to hear my former boss, the person who introduced me really to Washington life, and that was Jim Buckley, who had just written a new book, and he actually has another new book coming out very soon at age 93, and it was wonderful to hear him speak about the evolution of his thinking on some issues involving crucial regulatory policy. That was the subject of the last book, but it also reminded me about my own history, and that I've been so grateful to so many people in Washington, particularly people such as Becky and Michelle, who've been wonderful friends for a very long time. I thought that in order to talk about the election today, that I would take you back very, very far. To the first year that I came to AEI in 1979. And when I arrived, Jean Kirkpatrick, Reagan's ambassador to the United Nations, was a senior fellow at AEI, and she scared me to death. I was afraid to approach her. I was in enormous awe of her. But what I didn't realize at that time, she was working primarily on foreign policy issues at that time. She'd been thinking about dictatorships and double standards, was that Jean came to prominence in academic political science. Her first and most important book was a book called Political Woman that she wrote under the tutelage of a group that's since moved quite far to the left, the Center for the Study of the American Woman in Politics at the Eagleton Institute in New Jersey. And Jean did the first major survey of women in politics at the state legislative level. Under the imprimatur of the Rutgers Institute, she brought 28 women together who'd run for state office at the state legislative level and talked to them about impediments to running, about things that concern them, about balancing family life and work and careers, and it still stands as the first and perhaps most important work of that kind. There have been many since that time. But at the time, I remember her talking about the book because it was her central focus. But interestingly, when she wrote that book in 1974, there were no women in the cabinet, no woman who had served as a Supreme Court justice, no women in the Senate, no woman serving as a governor of a major state, no woman as a mayor of a major city, no woman in a top leadership post for either party. She expected, and she wrote at the end of the book, that we would see the gradual inclusion of more women in top politics. And today, as we know, women win at every level of our politics, same rate as men. The real obstacle is still getting women to run, and some of the obstacles that Jean wrote about in her book in terms of the concerns about family and career are still the ones that we're talking about today. But I think perhaps more important for the way that Republican women are covered today is something that also happened in the early 1970s. Female reporters were not allowed to join the National Press Club until 1972. They weren't allowed to go to the top floor of the press club at that particular point. That's the time when the Andrea Mitchells, the Judy Woodruffs, the Susan Faludis, the Susan Page, they came of age in a very, very different environment. Their generational experience of growing up at a time when many women face significant discrimination in the news business continues to color, I think, the way that women in politics are covered today. When the gender gap was born in the 1980 election, these women journalists wanted this story. They wanted the story that women had been held back in politics prior to that point, and they ran with the story overall, in part because of their own experience. So, of course, in 1992, the so-called Year of the Woman, an enormous amount of coverage of the strides that women had made. But when Republicans made strides in 1994, in terms of representation in Congress, there was very little coverage of it overall. I have seen only one story thus far, one major news story on what I think is the most important development in this election involving women in politics, and that is the extraordinary gains that women have made in state legislative contests. The Washington Times had a front page story earlier this week. Republicans picked up 47 women at the state legislative level, and Democrats lost 75. Very impressive. And I remember a story that I saw by Susanna Walsh, an ABC reporter. Early in the summer, I saw this nowhere else in the press. She reported that the state legislative committees had had a goal of originally recruiting 300 women to run in state legislative contests. They got nearly 600. Now, again, these women, to me, are so important. I don't know a lot about their politics, haven't had time to study them at this particular point, but they're the farm team. They're the team that's going to be rising in the ranks. They're the people who are going to be our candidates for Congress, our candidates for Senate going forward. Yet that story has received very little coverage at all. In part, because of Jean's work, we began to do some very substantial work on the gender gap after the 1980 election. You probably are all very familiar with the story. We hadn't seen a gender gap in our politics before the 1980 election. Women and men voted pretty much alike. In the 1950s, women were actually a little bit more conservative than men. Some of the revisionist thinking about the gender gap at this point suggests that we might have had a gender gap throughout our history before public opinion polls were available in the 1930s, but obviously it couldn't be measured at that particular time, and the gender gap may have been suppressed during World War II and only came back significantly in 1980. There's also a gender gap in British politics, with women, again, having different views than men, and so it's something that we're seeing in a lot of areas around the country. But we began to looking at polls from 1935 to 1980 about areas where men and women differed, and won't be a surprise to many of you that these are hardy perennials. They're very familiar to those of us who study American politics. Men and women consistently differ on the use of force, no matter how you define it. The death penalty, sending troops abroad, women are always more reluctant to use force. That still is true in our politics. Women and men have very different levels of risk tolerance. That isn't to say that women don't want to start a lot of businesses on their own, that they aren't very entrepreneurial and, of course, taking many risks in that regard. But still, if you ask a question, and this is one of my favorite in the polling literature, that's asked by CBS News and the New York Times, and it asks, if given the opportunity, would you like to ride on the space shuttle? There is a gender chasm on that question. Men love the idea of being able to ride on the space shuttle, and women are very skeptical about that. There are consistent differences in levels of knowledge about federal policy in particular, but not state and local policy. Women are just less likely to be informed. And I wouldn't go along with Jonathan Gruber, but certainly women have less levels of information about a lot of different issues. Interestingly, on most social issues, there are no differences between men and women, abortion being the most important example. Men and women feel very similarly about the issue of abortion. And all of those characteristics were present from 1935 to 1975, but starting in about 1975, we began to see two other things that have contributed significantly to the gender gap and to the marriage gap that we saw on Election Day this year. And those two things are women's perceptions of the country's economic future. Women are simply more pessimistic than men about the country's economic future. And they're also something that's really quite interesting. They're generally lagging indicators. if you ask, for example, if you ask men and women when the Soviet Union fell whether the fundamental nature of the Soviet Union had changed, men said, yes, it's changed, it's a new country, something's different. Women were much more reluctant to give that response, and of course they were right. And you also see it, for example, in perceptions of economic recovery. And I've been looking a lot at this because since the financial crisis in 2008, women have been consistently more pessimistic than men about the country's economic future, and I think that is very significant to our politics. When you look at that period from 1975 to 1980, and again, this is a very long history to get to the present, but women were entering the workforce in substantial numbers once again. Many of them were divorced and such, feeling more vulnerable, often last hired, at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of the workforce, and feeling more vulnerable generally. That pulled some women to the Democratic Party, and the gender gap was born. There are many misconceptions about the gender gap. It's not the size of the gender gap that matters. It's the directionality. Ronald Reagan won his election with the exact same size gender gap that Bob Dole lost. So whenever you hear pundits and politicians talking about the size of the gender gap, that really isn't a significant driver overall. Along with the study of the gender gap and all of those things that we saw from 1935 to 1975, and then the new issues from 75 to 80 are still present today, and that's what causes the gender gap in our politics overall. But we also decided at that point that we'd start looking at Republican and Democratic women running in the Senate and gubernatorial contests and those voting patterns overall. And we've just started to look at the results of the 2012 election, but the evidence seems to suggest by decade that women are voting in greater numbers for Democratic women. Now, it's not present across the board, but it's something that I think we're going to have to watch very carefully. And the reason that we're paying a lot of attention to these issues is because in 1980, for the first time, the rate of voting by men and women was the same. And because there are more women in the population than men, in 2012, about 8 million more women voted than men, and wasn't the same in 2014, but still significant changes over time. I'm also looking at a number of demographic changes that I think are going to affect our politics going forward, and certainly affected a lot of what we saw on Election Day, and in particular the rise in the number of single women and also childless women in the society. Today, that number is rising very sharply, the single women. Unmarried women were 38% of all adult women in 1970. They're 47% today, and that probably will approach 50% by the 2020 census. Very, very significant change overall, and an area where groups like this will have to make significant inroads and will make significant inroads going forward. But I wanted to talk about Jean for another reason, because this is an issue that had enormous resonance in the 2012 campaign. And though it's hard to remember, and I think Becky and Michelle probably remember this, many, many years ago, the Republican National Committee had a little journal, a highly regarded intellectual journal called Common Sense. A friend of ours, John Lofton, edited that many, many years ago. And one of the first things that John did as the editor of that publication was to ask Jean Kirkpatrick, who was then a Democrat, why she continued to be a Democrat. And she wrote an article for Common Sense called Why We Don't Become Republicans. She eventually did become a Republican, but at that time, she mentioned some things that I think would be very familiar to all of us. She said that she was deeply out of step with her party, particularly on issues of foreign policy, but she just couldn't make the switch at that point in her life. And she gave several reasons, and I think that the first one would be something that I expect that we would all share, and that is that party identification, that party ties are real, and they're deep, and they last, and it's very hard to change those. Jean had grown up in Oklahoma. Her husband was from Minnesota. She became a part of the Humphrey Brain Trust very early on, and those ties were really very, very important to her overall. But she said that there was something else, and a major reason, and perhaps the most important reason why she couldn't become a Republican. And writing, again, 30 years ago, she said that Republicans were more corporate, more country club, more the party of privilege. The problem, she says, and I'm going to quote some of this, was that many Democrats harbor a doubt about the GOP, doubts that the party cares enough about the whole, including those who were unable to look out for themselves. Since the New Deal, she said, it was almost always the Democrats who have moved first to provide aid, social status, and political rights. She concluded, and here I'm quoting her directly, "The problem is that the Republican Party has not articulated an inclusive vision of the public good that reflects the concern and the well-being of the whole." The compassion issue, which is what Jean was writing about, returned with a vengeance in the last campaign when, as I think you all know, the exit polls showed Mitt Romney lost those voters who, on the particular quality, cares about people like me by a rather significant margin, 81 to 18. He won on all the three other qualities that were important to voters: leadership, having the right positions on issues overall, but lost by a mile on this particular issue. And I think that's something that I think many younger conservatives and younger conservative women are addressing in a very forthright way. Fast forward to the 2012 election, and that was a rather long introduction in terms of what we learned in this particular election. As I said, for me, by far the most significant changes are the ones that we saw at the state legislative level, but clearly there were many other important victories on election night, and I think particularly the victory over, I hope, the war on women overall. But the marriage gap and the gender gap were still very prominent in that election. There are a lot of questions about turnout in this election still at this point. I don't think we know definitively, believe it or not. California still is only about halfway through in counting the ballots in California at this particular time. And there are a lot of things we don't know about turnout, but we expect that turnout is going to be the lowest for a midterm election. We clearly did a little bit better than the Democrats had done in 2008 and 2012 when they significantly re-engineered the business of public opinion polling. And we, too, use big data in a way that the Democrats had done so effectively in 2008 and 2012. And there's usually a kind of competition where each party does a little bit better than the party before it after a big loss, and that's clearly what happened in this election overall. The gender gap was large. It has been large in many elections, but once again, it's directionality and not the size of the gender gap that makes the difference in these key races overall. And you saw in a number of these races more women voting for Republican women, and that to me is very significant in an area where we will have to continue to improve. The marriage gap, again, very large. About 2/3 of voters were married, and they voted overwhelmingly for Republican candidates. But within the marriage gap, you continually see the pattern gender gap. Married men were more Republican than married women. And if you look at age cohorts, 18 to 29, to the extent that 18 to 29-year-olds were Republican, men were different from women once again. It is patterned. It is across virtually all groups in our politics overall. And paying attention, as I said, to the marriage gap, in part because of the growth of singles in the population. There's another reason to pay attention to it, and that is what we're learning demographically about childbearing. Usually the peak or the top childbearing years are the 40 to 44-year-old. Most people, even though more people are having children later in life, most of them are not having children after age 44. The number of childless women has doubled in the United States from 1980. And so again, childless women, more single women, a different approach to politics, and here's where I think that that Republicans will have to do a better job in the future, again, given the fact that those cohorts will be increasing in size overall. I wanted to talk a little about the millennials and what we learned about them in this election and some of their views overall. Again, things that Republicans and conservatives will need to be thinking a lot about going forward. They're such a distinctive generation in so many ways. Michelle was talking about having her children leave the nest. Well, I had one at home until fairly recently, and though he was always able to help me with problems with my BlackBerry and other kinds of things, I was very happy to see Jack move on. And he's coming back for Thanksgiving. I'm also very happy to see him coming back for Thanksgiving, but I was also very happy for him to move on. They're remarkably technologically literate, and the work that Pew has done suggests that they're looking now at the millennials in 4-year increments, because the way that 24 to 29-year-olds use technology is very different from the way that the younger group does, and very different from the 13 to 17-year-olds. Facebook is passé already for the front half of the millennial cohort overall, and they're into other kinds of things that are going to determine their technological prowess. They are, as a group, less conventionally religious. They are the group that is making up more and more the group we call the nones, N-O-N-E-S, in American politics. Two groups are growing nationally in our politics. The deeply religious and the nuns from a very, very small base, but again, being driven largely by the young. Just as a side note here, and this is really a tangent, but I think it's one of the most interesting findings I've seen in public opinion in a while. If you look at Catholics in America today, Catholics are about 25% of the population, or the voting population, and they have been for a very, very long time. But the Catholic Church has lost more parishioners than virtually any other denomination in the last 10 years. You know, we have a very vibrant religious marketplace. What's holding the Catholic Church up at that 25% level overall? Young Hispanics are more than half of all 18 to 29-year-old Catholics. So an extraordinary change that reveals perhaps the most important thing about the millennial generation, and that is their extraordinary diversity. 58% of millennials are white, 76% of older people are. If you look at the 1972 election, 90% of the electorate was white, and as Mitt Romney learned in the last election, he thought it would be 74% white. It was 72% white, and that explains what happened on election night. That explains why the Romney campaign believed that they were going to win up until Election Day, because they had underestimated the size of the minority voter roll. So enormous racial and ethnic diversity that's going to be very, very important going forward. Only 2% of them served in the military. Again, that's going to be something that will affect the society going forward. They, as I said, are less conventionally religious. Their views about government and business are quite interesting. They are skeptical of big government, but not hostile to it. Frank Luntz once did a famous poll in which he found that more of them believed they'd see a UFO than see a Social Security check. And but they want action, and I think that's one of the reasons that millennials in 1994 supported Newt Gingrich, and millennials in 2008 and 2012 supported Barack Obama. Those two people look like the candidates of action, and I think that's really important to the millennial generation overall. They have some other distinctive characteristics in terms of their views of big business. They are skeptical but not hostile, very, very similar to their views about government. And this also, I think, relates to their views about marriage. We know that, of course, most millennials are delaying marriage. I think the average age for first marriage for young women is 27. For men, it's 29. That's a huge change from two decades ago. But, of course, millennials will be married for a much longer period of their lives because of the extraordinary advances in longevity. So that's another way to think about these decisions to marry later overall. But I think in the way I relate this to their views about big business and big government, it doesn't seem like a natural connection here. But I think they're skeptical of the institution of marriage. 30% of millennials are the product of divorce. And so I think they're thinking differently about the institution of marriage. And then another one of the most interesting findings that I've seen in a long time, and I'm going to be talking about it in the next issue of the report that I do monthly for AEI on political trends, and that is we've seen very great changes in attitudes toward marriage, attitudes toward gay marriage, a lot of these kinds of things. But Gallup has asked a question about whether or not certain kinds of things are morally acceptable. And they've asked this question for many, many years. They have a complete trend from 2001. And they ask, for example, whether euthanasia is morally acceptable, whether having an abortion is morally acceptable, whether wearing fur is acceptable. It's just a wide, wide range of issues overall. And they've asked, again, with the identical trend question over time, about having a child outside of marriage. And about 58% now say that that is acceptable. But what's interesting about that since 2001 is that Republicans haven't moved at all. Only 40%, not only, but 40% of them say that this is acceptable, whereas Democrats have moved 20 percentage points since 2001. 72% of Democrats now say that that's morally acceptable. And I think that reflects the single coalition that Democrats are talking about as part of the rising American electorate. Single women is a key part of that group overall. The demographics are changing significantly. Marriage patterns are changing significantly. Most millennials say that they want to marry. Very few. It's about 9% for the population as a whole. It's about 5%. About 54% of Americans are married today. So all of these trends are playing into our politics. One of the great positive signs, well, a couple of positive signs I see in the millennials overall, and one of them relates to their skepticism about the federal government, to their skepticism of big business, and to their skepticism about the institution of marriage. One of the Democratic pollsters that I work with, who's going to be polling for Hillary, Jeff Guerin, has always had a contract with one of the big youth TV things. I won't tell you which one it is, but they are in the field all the time asking millennials their views and young people their views about what they watch, consume, those kinds of things overall. And they began to see a very interesting response that they had never seen before in the early 1990s. They asked young people what they wanted to be when they grew up. And they get all the familiar answers, doctor, lawyer, teacher, nurse, very familiar answers. But in the early 1990s, they saw something they'd never seen before. A lot of young people were volunteering that they wanted to be small businessmen or small businesswomen. Again, when you think about it, if you don't think you can count on the federal government, if you don't think you can count on big business, if you've seen neighbors and friends laid off in a very deep recession, if you're the product of divorce and don't feel you can count on that other central institution of marriage overall, you think a lot about becoming an entrepreneur. And one of the things that we know when we look at young people is that they are generally the most pessimistic group about where they are in the life cycle. It's what we call a life cycle effect in demographics. Most pessimistic, bottom of the earnings, low on the totem pole overall, but they're also the most optimistic about their future prospects. A large number of millennials think they're going to be rich. No, maybe that will happen, maybe it won't, but I'm particularly encouraged by the interest in entrepreneurship, which I think will provide all sorts of dividends for Republicans and conservatives going forward. And I think maybe one of the reasons that we've seen the interest of young men and particularly young women in state legislative races overall, I think they're going to bring a different perspective to politics going forward. The other thing that interested me about the millennials, and again, perhaps this is because a lot of them have had a civic service requirement, probably a lot of you have had that to graduate from high school overall, they're saying that they think they can make a significant difference in our politics at the state and local level. They're not particularly interested in being involved in national level politics, and that's a kind of silver lining to the views of distrust and other views about government overall. So again, what am I watching most closely going forward in terms of demographic and public opinion trends? Clearly the makeup of the electorate, the fact that young women are surpassing young men in terms of educational levels in virtually every area at this particular point. The gap there overall I think is going to be significant, and I think it has the possibility, there's a real opportunity to pull more young women to conservative and Republican ways of thinking overall. I think that will be important. Watching the number of single women, number of women who stay single for a very long period of time, I think that's going to be very important to politics going forward. Democrats didn't do quite as well with the rising American electorate as they expected to do. A lot of that was a turnout phenomenon in 2014. And I think a lot of it was overkill for the war on women. If you look at the first 9 weeks of the Udall-Cory Gardner campaign, Udall only ran 2 ads that were not about the war on women. I mean, just an extraordinary heavy coverage that issue overall didn't resonate for a lot of Colorado voters, and of course people thought that it went too far overall. But I'm watching in particular those trends. And decreasing interest in, or not just decreasing interest in marriage. The divorce rate is finally leveling off. I think that's a very positive development. If you look at the numbers, even though the rate of teen pregnancy has gone down very, very significantly over time, the number of women having children on their own is clearly growing very, very fast for whites, blacks, Hispanics. It's a very big trend. Was at a seminar yesterday with Anna Greenberg, the Democratic pollster, and probably the premier Democratic pollster today, and she was saying that they're really counting on this group that's going to have a very different attitude toward marriage and toward child rearing overall. So I must admit I'm really quite optimistic after 2014. The gender gap is going to continue to be with us. You're going to hear it misreported in the media. The media are continually not going to report on the things such as the growth of Republican and conservative women at the state legislative level, where so many important decisions start and where the farm team starts out overall. And so I'm really quite optimistic about prospects for Republicans and conservatives going forward. Now, if we just had a candidate, no. Overall, I could go on just to say a few words about the polls in particular. I've said this, and maybe perhaps some of you have heard me say this before. I don't think the polling business will be around as we know it in 2020. The problems are just too serious. Most of the very well-designed polls, whether they're Gallup or Pew, have now a 9% response rate if they're extraordinarily well done. We can't go below that to get a sample that looks like America. You just can't do it. So those pollsters are already experimenting with a lot of social media, Google Analytics. We've looked at a couple of trends, asking the same kind of questions and getting the same kind of data from Google Analytics, and the trend lines parallel one another in terms of attitudes, but the levels are so very different. I'm not an expert certainly on big data overall, but we do know that what the Democrats did in 2008, what Joel Bennison and his team of 8 pollsters that worked for Obama will do, when I describe that as re-engineering the polls, instead of asking you all the familiar questions about what you think on abortion or what you think about the economy. I mean, they asked those questions. They did benchmark surveys at the beginning of the campaign. But they actually did something quite different, which is what the proprietary world of public opinion polling has been so sophisticated at overall for so many years, and that is the kinds of questions that Procter & Gamble and The Gap ask you about what the hot color is going to be for spring. I mean, this is the biggest part of the polling business in America, and they both do standard traditional polling and also work with a lot of social media overall. But what the Democrats did in 2008 with this team, and I must admit, those of us who were looking at some of the early ads that they were running in terms of recruiting, they were hiring physicists. They were hiring mathematicians. They weren't hiring political operatives at the early part of that campaign. What they were doing was hiring people who could get big databases to talk to one another, so that the way a particular proprietary set of data that might be available from corporate America on a whole list of dimensions, let's say the car you drive, where you like to buy your gas, just millions of different dimensions. They got those databases to talk to one another in 2008. It's an extraordinarily hard thing to do. We've been working on it, and I'm on the board of the Pew Research Center. I have been until recently, and we too hired mathematicians and physicists this summer to try to get a big data set that was offered to us to talk to the data that we've been collecting for the last 25 years. And so instead of asking you about your political positions, though they did do that, they asked you about your affinities. And that's how they developed the information that then went to people's little handheld computers that told them, what to talk about to people at every other door. And they also found out something that we should all know about American politics, and that is, it turns out it's pretty important to ask people for their vote. And of course, that's what they did with those teams of field operatives in 2008 in particular. One of the stories in the Post about big data a few weeks ago talked about one of the Republican firms in this election, and the little handheld computer that person took from door to door in North Carolina had 700 pieces of information on each voter. And that's all the affinity information. It's not necessarily the political views. But that's the way this profession is moving, in part because of the serious inadequacies in polling overall. I still think polls are a very useful tool to understand a complex and heterogeneous public, particularly if you can marry them with demographic data, as I've been trying to do at a very general level and not at a specific level. But I want to just end with one of my favorite polling trends. This is a question that the Gallup organization asked for the first time in 1937. And they asked whether or not you would vote for a qualified woman for a woman for president if she were qualified in every other way. That's exactly the way Gallup asked that question the first time that they asked it. And they changed the question the next year. They added a whole series of other questions about willingness to vote for a Catholic, willingness to vote for a Baptist, willingness to vote for someone who's gay. I mean, they've added all those other issues over time. But that year, only 30% of men and women, and there were no differences on that issue, said that they would be willing to vote for a woman for president. Time Yankelovich asked the first question about willingness to vote for Hillary Clinton in 1992. Perhaps surprisingly, they asked whether or not she would be qualified to be a candidate for president, and very few people said she would at that particular point. It will be very interesting to see what we learn as we go forward. So I've covered a lot of ground. I hope that this has been something that can be useful in terms of your thoughts about elections and politics, and I'm happy to answer any question. So anyway.
We have a microphone here. If you would state your name and affiliation and Thank you so much. That was a
Yeah,
lot to
thank you.
think
Thank you.
about.
Good.
Thank you very much, Karlyn. I'm Diane Katz with Heritage. Given some of the dramatic changes you've seen in the composition of women's as a bloc, what are some of the major directional changes you're seeing in political views among women? Or are they not changing all that much?
Yeah. Haven't seen a lot of significant changes in the last few years. The top issue for women and for men is the economy, the economy, the economy, jobs, jobs, jobs. Nothing else comes close. Healthcare tends to be the second-ranked issue, but that's been true for a very long time, with women's concern about that a little bit higher than men's. Issues such as abortion, gay marriage, very, very low down on the list of things that are of concern to women. The one social issue where we do see significant male-female differences is on the issue of gay marriage, where women are more accepting than are men. But we see an awful lot of stability and not significant changes in direction overall.
Over here.
No.
Thank you. Jenny Thomas. And I just wondered, with all your reference towards the end on the big data and what they're doing on the Democrat side, why didn't it come through in the midterms, 2010, 2014?
Yeah. We did it better. Republicans and conservatives did it better. They learned a lot from what had happened in 2008 and 2012. And in some ways, if you talk to someone like Anna Greenberg, they pretty much knew what was going to happen in Colorado. At the time, we were just beginning to see glimmers of hope about that. I mean, their data was good. They didn't have turnout. Their people did not turn out, particularly single women, particularly minorities. It's very hard to turn. They're just not reliable voters overall, and they didn't turn out on election day. The share of the minority share of the electorate in terms of turnout, which was smaller than it's been in the past, as was the share of single women. So they didn't turn out their base with this fancy field operation. I don't know enough about the internal Democratic Party politics, but there was some concern early on that the Obama administration, this proprietary database that they created, was invaluable. And there was a lot of concern early on that they were not going to share that widely with a lot of other candidates. Whereas, I don't know a lot about what the Republicans have done, other than they were playing catch up. They realized they had a serious problem, and a couple of the big data Republican groups joined forces at the end. Again, I'm not as familiar with how they did what they did, but you learn always from the lessons and the mistakes of the last campaign, and that's what I think the GOP did. Very low turnout election overall, as you know. Yes. Yeah.
Delana Tonks. I'm just visiting from Salt Lake City, Utah today, so happy to be here. The 9% response rate on the polling, are they done by phone? Can you clarify that question?
Okay.
And what efforts are being made to engage the millennials where they are at? Because they're not here.
The 9% response rate for well-designed surveys is a standard random digit dialing survey that includes both landlines and cell phones. A lot of the pollsters used about 60% cell phones because the population, of course, is moving that way, particularly millennials overall. It's very expensive for pollsters to survey survey cell phones. Databases of telephone exchanges are available, listed and unlisted. You can get those, you can buy those easily, but it's polling via cell phone, particularly because everybody has different numbers from where they are, so you have to ask a lot of screening questions at the beginning of the survey overall to get people to respond to you. But the 9% response rate is for the best designed survey, multilingual. For example, nearly all of the major surveys conduct their interviews in Spanish and English now. Gallup, Pew, that's important to them. They've got to get people to talk to them, to keep people on the phone overall. But they're 60% cell phone as we move closer to the end of the campaign. So they're moving in that way. So it's a standard statistical sample overall. But they're really worried about that kind of a response rate. Yes.
Hi, Kelly Kullberg from Columbus, Ohio. I think I saw a Faith and Freedom survey that said that roughly 1 in 3 voters in November this year were identifying as either Christian and or conservative, and that 86% of those voters voted Republican. Is that a change certainly from 08 and 12? And could you comment on the Christian vote?
Yeah. Just for a little background on this, for many, many decades, pollsters studied denomination primarily because that gave us a good idea of which way the electoral winds were going to blow. But starting perhaps in the mid-'80s, we began looking at what the sociologists call religiosity, degree of religious participation in activism. And part of that was because of the growth of the evangelical conservative community. As I said, two groups are growing, the nuns, but from a much larger base, evangelicals, born again. And I think those figures are right from the exit poll overall. That's not a big change. Today, a Catholic who goes to Mass every week has more in common with a Protestant who goes to services every week and a Jew who goes to synagogue every week than that Catholic has in common with a Catholic who doesn't go to church at all. That's a very, very big change in our politics. And that started, we began seeing that in the 1980s, so it's your degree of religious involvement that determines your political views overall. And I should have brought my exit poll with me, and I'm sorry that I didn't, but that wouldn't surprise me that number would be 86%, because the deeply religious group, in particular, very overwhelmingly Republican, and the nuns leaning quite heavily to the Democrats at this point overall. Interesting thing about the nuns, many of them say they believe in God. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense at this point, and we like to say that things like marriages, mortgages, and children bring you into the voting booth and also back to church. We just don't know at this point what we're seeing about the growth of the nuns overall. It's just too early. Yeah.
I had a question.
Sure.
It's about voter fraud.
Yes.
And you always sound a little conspiratorial when you start talking about
Yeah.
voter fraud. And I've read a lot about it, and I know there's a couple of people working on it very hard. It kind of hit home. One of my sons went to vote in Northern Virginia, and he was told he'd already voted. This is with picture ID. And so his vote didn't count. He had to go to the county building. It was total chaos. They said, come back the next way. As it turned out, it didn't make a difference. We didn't have one vote differences. But what is your sense about that? And that are people only concerned about it when it hits them or somebody they know?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I hope some people are working on it. I don't know how extensive the problem is. You read the anecdotal evidence.
Right.
But since we are a federal system with voting procedures controlled at the state level, it's probably pretty hard. I mean, John Fund, formerly of the Wall Street Journal, has done a lot of work on voter fraud, and Hans von Spakovsky did a wonderful piece in the Journal before the election about the degree and the extent of it. But with 50 different states voting in different ways, I mean, as I said, they're still counting the ballots in California. It's astonishing. And in Alaska, they're probably going to take even longer to still count the votes. And so a lot of things can happen at the local level.
I ran into one of my neighbors at the grocery store who's a Democrat and who does the voting at our voting place. And I told her this story, and she said, oh, Michelle, there's so much for us to do now. We got to look at the list. We got to look at the picture. We got to be there so early in the morning. She says, voter ID, and she goes like that.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh, okay. It just makes me so uncomfortable.
It's sort of interesting. Americans in historical polling data going back for a very long time have always supported having a national identity card. I mean, that drives some libertarians up the wall, but you get those numbers are up around 80%, and perhaps
Yeah.
it's
I have a
tangential.
question.
Yes.
Actually, two questions. One, can you comment a little bit about the polls that we were hearing prior to this election that had these races so close, and Purdue and Georgia was going to be forced into a runoff, and Kay Hagan was going to survive in North Carolina, and Ed Gillespie was so far behind he didn't have a prayer of a chance. Well, of course, we know what this information does. I mean, with Ed Gillespie, putting that information out means money's pulled away, money's not given, people don't go vote because they figure their vote's not going to make a difference. So that's one question about the poll discrepancies. The second question is specifically related to Terry Lynn land in Michigan. I didn't watch that race very closely, but I did read several articles about it, and one that caught my eye that just enraged me was she's been elected to statewide office up there successfully. Her husband is a successful businessman. Like many, in fact, probably most married couples in America, they consider the money they earn their money, not his money or her money. So she used some of their money in the campaign, and she was attacked for using his money. It wasn't her money. And I think that there were other things, of course, that had an impact on that race, but I was just shocked by this, and I just wonder if you were aware of that and what your take might have been on that particular situation.
I wasn't aware of Terry Linland. I didn't follow that. I mean, I followed the race, but I sort of missed that chapter in trying to keep track of all of these races. But and so I can't comment on that. The polling business in the United States is not a very introspective business. A lot of things probably went wrong, and there were probably a lot of little errors that combined to make these predictions as far off as they were. A lot of polls, it's possible, of course, that a lot of these races were moving over the course of the weekend, and a lot of the pollsters stopped polling on the Thursday and Friday before Election Day. That certainly has happened in other races that benefited us, where people weren't polling over the course of the election, or over the last few days of an election, and things moved. I mean, there's still a big question about what happened with Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. The hostages, there had been an announcement that the hostages were released, but then they weren't released, and again, this is ancient history, but a lot of people felt that that really sealed the deal over the weekend before the election, when only Dick Werthland and Pat Caddell, polling for Jimmy Carter at that point, were really in the field, really had the resources to be in the field that late in a campaign. Getting the makeup of the electorate right is really hard these days. Peter Hart once told me, the Democratic pollster, that for their NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, to get a sample, a really solid sample of 1,200, they need to make 31,000 phone calls over a period of time. That's how long it takes to get a sample that looks like American. And if you look back to the 2012 campaign, Neil Newhouse, polling for Romney, made an assumption that was a very reasonable assumption. He thought the electorate was going to be 74% white, and it wasn't, and that's what explained the turn of that election campaign overall. So turnout assumptions, very, very difficult for pollsters, but that, I mean, there's got to be a lot more going on. There is a belief that pollsters have a very hard time sampling Republicans in rural areas. If you look, for example, at where the polls were most wrong in this election, it appears that rural density equals Democrats. So the closer you are to central cities, the more Democratic you are. And as you move out to the exurbs in the rural, you get more Republican. For some reason or other, it's just harder to get to people in rural America, and that certainly may have made the difference, probably made the difference in Kansas overall. There are all sorts of other little things. In off-year elections, the pollsters have tended to underestimate the Republicans in the electorate overall. In presidential election years, they've tended to underestimate Democrats in a lot of key races. So many things can go wrong. I don't think the business can be around by 2020. I don't know what's going to replace it. If you look at a lot of the experiments that are being done with Google Analytics, let's say on something like flu prevalence. For the first couple of years, Google called flu prevalence in every county in the country absolutely correctly over the course of the normal flu season. But then for the next 2 years, they got it completely wrong. There are just a lot of things to work out, but I don't think we can rely on the polls. Very few pollsters have the resources to do in-person surveying. It's just so unbelievably expensive. Perhaps the only one that does this regularly is the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. Clearly, there's a lot of experimentation with social media and trying to understand what we learned from social media about political preferences. If you look at a company like Procter & Gamble, which used a huge amount of RDD, random digit dialing, for all of their conceptual product work for many, many years, they moved heavily towards social media and understanding their customers more overall, and perhaps that's the direction we'll go, but it's just really hard. In 1992, when the polls miscalled the election in Great Britain, the polling community itself set up a review board and held hearings, again, an informal review board, just to try to figure out what had gone wrong. There's a conference going on now at UVA about this very subject, trying to understand what has gone wrong, but the polling profession here just isn't as introspective. And the other big problem with the polling profession, from my point of view, is that they're dropping a lot of the great historical questions. And because they're so intent on following the media's lead about, we'll have probably 10 polls on immigration by tonight or something like that. And
Like
then
what
and then they'll
questions?
drop it.
What are they dropping?
They're the historical questions about things such as the American dream, what that means, how that's changed over time. We've been looking a lot at that, and it's hard to find definitive trends. I'm interested in a lot of the old questions about religion and belief in God and what that tells us. Those things are very important. That question that I mentioned about willingness to vote for lots of different kinds of candidates. There's only one group about whom a bare majority would not vote, and that's still atheists. I want to know whether that's changing. People are willing to vote for somebody who's gay, a Muslim, whatever, but not an atheist. But that question hasn't been asked in 3 years, and so I want to know if that's changing over time. Very interested in looking at questions on out-of-wedlock childbirth, the acceptability of that, just that chasm that I mentioned between Democrats and Republicans, talking about its moral what's changing? I mean, what's driving these kinds of attitudes overall? So there are many, many questions that I'd like to see them repeat. One of my favorite questions that asked people whether or not the Federal Reserve was a fine Kentucky bourbon. And there are a lot of great questions like that are in the polling literature too, that I just want to know how much people know. I mean, that's another interesting part of survey research, so anyway.
Well, thank you. What an
Thank you.
excellent
Thank you.
discussion and
Thank you.
talk. Thank you very much. We're going to give some bits here for
Wonderful.
We love to have you come anytime, but
thank
especially
you.
after elections.
Thank
Now,
you
I
so
know
much.
you've spoken before. I think you have an earlier limited edition
I
Claire
do.
Booth Lewis Policies and Coffee Mug, but this still has her famous saying.
Oh, wonderful.
What
No
is
good
it?
deed.
No good deed goes unpunished.
Yes. And this is definitely new, a new
Oh,
tote bag for
lovely.
you to
Thank
put
you.
all your other gifts in here.
More gifts? Good heavens.
Yeah, and then, of course, the Heritage Foundation,
Oh,
what do we
wonderful.
produce here?
Yeah,
Well, we
okay.
produce research, so
Yes.
you get your own personal updated copy of the Heritage Guide to the
Oh,
Constitution.
Wonderful from Matt's Foley. Oh, it's wonderful.
And,
Thank you so much, Becky.
it's a
That's
great project,
wonderful.
and you'll enjoy
That
that.
is a great project, and I will enjoy it. My colleagues at AEI and I now have a set of, we want C-SPAN to start giving away, silverware, because we have 26 coffee cups accumulated over a very long period of time, but we want them to move on. But
That's
this
right.
is a new coffee cup. I
There
don't
you
have
go.
one of these.
Those are
Plates.
plates. I'll let you have
Thank
that.
you so much.
And we have a lunch for you all, Beck, right?
Yes, we do, right across the hall in Van Andel, and Karlyn will be joining us, and I will say that you should follow Karlyn Bowman, because she does a great job on all this
How do we
stuff.
get that monthly report you mentioned?
You can just sign up for it, I think, at www.aei.org. So,
Terrific.
good. Thank you.
All right,
Thank
thank
you
you
so
all
much.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.